Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. And if you're settling in for this journey through the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia where gods walked among reeds and ziggurats pierced the heavens, you should know that the air here is thick with the scent of baked earth and temple incense, the kind that makes your eyes water slightly if you stand too close to the braziers. And honestly, you probably won't survive this, not because of any genuine danger, but because you'll be so deeply asleep before we even reach the 2nd millennium BCE that you'll miss all the good parts about divine councils and cosmic matrimonial disputes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'd rather have a small audience of genuine history enthusiasts than a massive crowd of people who clicked by accident while searching for cat videos. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world, whether you're in Tokyo at dawn or Toronto at midnight, because there's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across this spinning planet yet gathered here in this peculiar digital temple dedicated to the Anunnaki. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we step into the ruins of Eridu, the first city according to Sumerian tradition, where the foundations were laid not by human hands but by the god Enki himself, who chose this marshy spot at the edge of the Persian Gulf to build his temple, the Iabzu, the house of the cosmic waters. And archaeology confirms that Eridu truly is among the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia, with settlement layers dating back to roughly 5,400 BCE, making it genuinely ancient, even by ancient standards, the kind of ancient that makes Egyptian pyramids look like recent renovations. And here in these earliest levels we find small shrines rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spot, each generation constructing their temple directly atop the ruins of the previous one, creating a layered cake of devotion that rises through the centuries. And the Sumerians themselves looked back at Eridu with a kind of nostalgic reverence, the way we might think of some idyllic past that probably never existed quite as perfectly as we remember it. And in their king lists, those peculiar documents that record rulers reigning for impossibly long periods, Eridu appears as the first city to receive kingship after it descended from heaven, whatever that precisely means. And this is where things get deliciously murky, because the term Anunnaki itself, written in cuneiform as Anunnaki, or sometimes Anunna, literally translates to something like those of princely seed or offspring of Anu, Anu being the sky god, the distant father figure of the pantheon, who mostly stays out of day-to-day affairs like a cosmic CEO who only shows up for the really important board meetings. And the Anunnaki in the earliest texts are simply the great gods collectively, the major deities who determine fates and govern the cosmos, nothing more exotic than that, though later traditions, and particularly much later interpreters, have taken these references and constructed elaborate theories involving ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, and gold mining operations staffed by primitive humans, theories that are admittedly entertaining and make for excellent late-night television, but have approximately zero support from actual Sumerian literature or archaeology. Yet we can't entirely blame the theorists, because Sumerian religion is genuinely strange by modern standards, filled with gods who behave more like squabbling relatives than omnipotent beings, deities who get drunk at parties, engage in rather earthy romances, and occasionally destroy humanity in fits of pique before regretting it later. Very relatable, honestly, and scholars debate endlessly about how literally the Sumerians took their own mythology, whether they truly believed Enki created humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, or whether these were sophisticated metaphors for natural processes and social structures. And the truth is, we'll never entirely know because we're separated from these people by nearly 5,000 years and a completely alien cultural context. Though one thing is certain, the Sumerians took their religious obligations seriously, building massive temple complexes, employing hundreds of priests and priestesses, and recording everything in meticulous detail on clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of tablets, most of them containing not cosmic mysteries but mundane administrative records, lists of barley, rations, and sheep deliveries, the kind of bureaucratic documentation that makes modern tax forms look exciting by comparison, which is actually rather funny when you think about it. We've spent enormous resources deciphering these ancient texts, hoping for profound wisdom, and mostly what we get is Bronze Age spreadsheets. Not that these aren't valuable, they absolutely are for understanding daily life and economic systems, but they lack a certain mystical grandeur. Meanwhile, the actual mythological texts, The ones describing creation and divine adventures are often fragmentary, damaged, or exist in multiple contradictory versions because the Sumerians never established an official canon. Different cities had different patron gods and slightly different stories. Eridu favored Enki naturally, Nippur championed Enlil, Uruk celebrated Inanna, and each city's scribes emphasized their local deity's importance, creating a complex web of sometimes competing narratives that scholars must painstakingly untangle. And when we talk about the earliest Anunnaki records, we're primarily discussing texts from the early dynastic period around 2600 to 2350 BCE and the following Akkadian period, when writing had become sophisticated enough to record extended narratives. Before this writing existed, but was used mainly for accounting, which means our window into Sumerian religious thought begins well after these beliefs had already developed for centuries or possibly millennia in purely oral form. So what we're reading is essentially a snapshot of a tradition already ancient to its own practitioners. And in these texts, the Anunnaki appear as a collective divine assembly. They meet in a special chamber called the Ubshukina, which might be in the city of Nippur, or might exist in some celestial dimension. The texts aren't entirely clear, and here they make decisions about cosmic order, human destiny, and which city will prosper this year, functioning rather like a divine parliament, or perhaps more accurately, like a contentious family reunion, where everyone has opinions and nobody quite agrees. And the number of Anunnaki varies by text. Sometimes there are 7, sometimes 50, sometimes it seems like a much larger group, and they're generally distinguished from another group called the Ajigi, who in some texts are younger gods, assigned menial labor. And if this sounds confusing, that's because it absolutely is. Sumerian theology wasn't systematic, it was organic and evolved over time, with layers upon layers of local traditions and political considerations. After all, when one city conquered another, the gods had to be diplomatically merged or ranked, leading to elaborate genealogies that connected everyone into one big divine family tree, albeit a deeply dysfunctional one, where siblings fought over water rights and fathers disinherited sons over property disputes. Truly, the gods were made in humanity's image as much as the reverse. Sitting here in hypothetical Eridu's ruins, watching the sun set over the marshlands that once surrounded this sacred place, you can almost imagine the priests processing through the temple gates, their white linen robes catching the last light, carrying offerings of bread and beer to the god's statue, treating it as though Enki himself might physically consume these gifts, because in their understanding he actually would. Not literally perhaps, but in some essential way the divine presence inhabited the statue and accepted the worship, and maintaining this relationship between human and divine was considered absolutely critical. It kept the cosmic order functioning, ensured harvests arrived on schedule, floods stayed within manageable bounds, and enemies were confounded. And if you think this sounds like a tremendous amount of work for uncertain returns, you're not wrong. The temple establishments consumed enormous resources, land, labor, and goods, functioning as economic powerhouses that rivaled or exceeded royal authority, which occasionally created tension between temple and palace that echoes through the administrative texts in passive-aggressive tableted form. Nothing quite like a 4000-year-old memo complaining about budget allocations to make you realize human nature never really changes. And throughout all of this, through all the ritual and record-keeping and theological speculation, the Anunnaki remain somewhat mysterious, even to the people who worship them. They're simultaneously present and remote, intimately involved in human affairs, yet fundamentally other. And modern readers often want clear answers that simply don't exist. We want to know exactly what the Sumerians believed about these beings, whether they thought them physical or spiritual, where they came from, what they wanted. But the texts reflect a worldview where such categorical questions might not have made sense. The Anunnaki simply were, they had always been, and they would continue to be as long as the temples stood and the offerings were made, which turned out to be quite a long time indeed, though not forever. Nothing is forever. Even civilizations that carve their words in stone eventually fall silent, but that's for later sections. For now we're still in the beginning, in Eridu, where the first temple rises from the marsh, where the first words are being pressed into soft clay, where the story of the Anunnaki is just beginning to be written down, even though it's already ancient. And if you're still awake at this point, I'm genuinely surprised. You're either remarkably resistant to the soporific effects of Bronze Age theology, or you've actually found this fascinating. Either way, I applaud your dedication. And as we prepare to move deeper into the specifics of Anunnaki mythology and the gods who comprise this enigmatic group, take a moment to notice how heavy your eyelids are becoming, how the rhythm of these words is starting to blend together into a kind of verbal white noise, soothing and continuous like water flowing over stones in an irrigation channel, like wind through the date palms that lined Mesopotamian fields, like the sound of a stylus scratching across clay in some long-vanished scribe's hand, recording debts and hymns and royal propaganda, all of it dust now, all of it except the words which somehow survived, buried in rubble, baked in fires that destroyed the cities that housed them, waiting millennia to be read again by people who would find them strange and fascinating, and somehow still relevant, because the questions the Sumerians asked are questions we still ask. Where did we come from? What do the gods or universe or whatever powers exist want from us? How do we live a good life in the face of chaos and uncertainty? And the Anunnaki in their various contradictory glory don't provide neat answers. They provide stories, strange, beautiful, complicated stories that reflect a world both utterly alien to ours and intimately familiar, and that's what makes this journey worth taking, this late-night drift through ancient texts and archaeological ruins, because in learning about how the Sumerians understood their world, we perhaps understand our own a little better, or at least we pass some very pleasant hours before sleep takes us, which is really the point of all this. So breathe deeply, relax, and prepare to meet the Anunnaki properly as we step beyond Eridu's gates and into the fuller landscape of Sumerian theology. The great gods of the Anunnaki gather in Nippur's sacred precinct, in the Ekkur temple that means literally mountain house, because even though Mesopotamia is famously flat, the Sumerians built artificial mountains in the form of ziggurats, stepped pyramids of mud brick reaching toward the heavens, and atop these structures temples housed the divine presence, and Nippur with its Ekkur dedicated to Enlil functions as the religious capital of Sumer, neutral ground where no king rules directly, but where all kings must seek legitimacy, and here historically, tablets record real administrative councils, gatherings of city representatives who made decisions about everything from canal maintenance to trade disputes, showing that religious ideology mirrored and perhaps justified political reality, as above so below, or perhaps more accurately, as in the assembly hall so in the heavens, and Enlil himself is the chief executive of the pantheon, lord of the wind and breath, the force that separates heaven and earth, somewhat irascible, prone to dramatic decisions, not unlike a Bronze Age monarch really, while his brother, or sometimes half-brother Enki rules the sweet waters beneath the earth, the Abzu, and Enki is clever, crafty, the problem solver who's usually trying to help humanity, often against his brother's wishes, creating a fundamental tension in the myths between Enlil's stern authority and Enki's compassionate wisdom, and scholars debate whether this reflects some historical split between priestly factions or competing city-states, Nippur versus Eridu, with their theological disagreements worked out through mythology rather than open conflict, or whether it's simply good storytelling that gods should have contrasting personalities. Heroes need foils after all, and in the Sumerian creation myths which exist in several versions, none of them complete, the universe begins with water, primordial and undifferentiated, the freshwater Abzu, and the salt water Tiamat, though Tiamat is more prominent in later Babylonian versions. And from these waters the gods emerge or are born. The texts vary, and they separate heaven and earth, and Enki, which were originally one thing, and from this separation everything else follows, and humanity doesn't exist yet, won't exist for a while, because the gods have work to do first. They have to create the world's features, dig rivers, pile up mountains, establish the cosmic order called me, which is a fascinating concept that's half natural law and half cultural institution. There are me for kingship, for warfare, for brewing beer, for sex, for writing, hundreds of me that together comprise civilized existence, and these me are portable somehow. They can be stolen or given as gifts, which creates excellent plot opportunities in myths where clever goddesses seduce their way into obtaining important me and carrying them off to their own cities. Classic intellectual property theft on a divine scale, and the fringe theorists absolutely adore these me, because they interpret them as technology or information storage devices, ancient hard drives containing forbidden knowledge, which is a creative reading, but relies on ignoring that the Sumerians explicitly describe me as concepts and powers, not objects. Though to be fair, the line between object and concept was perhaps blurrier for them than for us. We're very materialist in our thinking, while they inhabited a more enchanted universe where everything from the rivers to the grain to the clay itself possessed some degree of divinity, or at least divine association, and into this newly organized cosmos, the gods bring forth plants and animals, establishing agriculture and herding, which makes sense because the Sumerians were farmers and shepherds. Their myths ground themselves in the realities of their lives. Wheat and barley feature prominently in these stories, alongside sheep and cattle, the foundations of Mesopotamian economy and diet. Not exactly glamorous, but absolutely essential. And there's something refreshingly practical about a mythology, where the gods' great accomplishments include inventing the plow and establishing proper irrigation techniques, very on brand for a civilization that had to coax life from a challenging landscape through constant intelligent labor. You don't survive between the Tigris and Euphrates without understanding hydraulic engineering. Those rivers flood unpredictably, violently, nothing like the benign predictable Nile that made Egypt comparatively easy mode. Mesopotamian farmers fought for every harvest, which perhaps explains why their gods are so temperamental. When disaster can strike without warning, you develop a religion that reflects that precarity. And speaking of disasters, the Great Flood features in Sumerian mythology, long before it appears in Hebrew scripture. The Eridu Genesis describes how humanity has become too noisy, disturbing Enlil's sleep. Seriously, that's the reason given. We're too loud. So Enlil decides to wipe us out with a flood. But Enki warns his favorite human Sudra, who builds a boat and saves himself along with animals and seeds. And after 7 days and nights the storm subsides. Sudra offers sacrifices, and the gods smell the pleasant aroma and realize they've made a terrible mistake because who's going to feed them now? The gods apparently need humanity's offerings to survive, or at least to live comfortably, which is quite the reversal from later monotheistic theology, where God needs nothing from us. Here the relationship is explicitly reciprocal. Humans need the gods' blessings, and the gods need humans' labor and worship, symbiotic or parasitic, depending on your perspective. And this flood story parallels the later Akkadian and Babylonian versions, with Atrahasis and Utnapishtim. And yes, it's almost certainly an ancestor to the Noah narrative in Genesis, because catastrophic floods were a real and recurring danger in Mesopotamia. The stories remember actual events even if they've accrued mythological elaboration, and the scholarly debates about the historicity of these flood accounts continue, with some archaeologists pointing to flood deposits in various city levels, while others argue these are localized events, not regional catastrophes. But the point is, the myth expresses a profound truth regardless of historical accuracy, that disaster can strike without warning, that divine favor is uncertain, and that survival requires both human ingenuity and divine mercy in unpredictable combination. Heavy themes for a bedtime story, but delivered in such a matter-of-fact tone in the original texts that the horror is almost deadpan. Yes, the gods tried to exterminate humanity. Yes, we survived through clever boat building. What's for dinner? This absolutely perfect example of ancient humor appears when the gods, starving after the flood, gather like flies around Sudra's sacrifice, which is both vivid and slightly undignified. These divine beings reduced to desperate hunger, circling around cooked meat. And I like to imagine the Sumerian audience chuckling at that image, recognizing their own gods' all-too-human foibles. Because humor bridges millennia surprisingly well, we can still appreciate a well-deployed simile, even across massive cultural distance. And after the flood, humanity continues, chastened perhaps but continuing, and the myths move into the period of the antediluvian kings, those rulers who supposedly reigned before the flood for impossibly long periods. We're talking 28,000 years for one king, 43,000 for another, numbers that make no literal sense but perhaps expressed something about the mythic past being qualitatively different from historical time. Or maybe they used different counting systems, or maybe the scribes were just having fun with big numbers. Scholars truly don't know, and these king lists that record these enormous reigns are peculiar documents, mixing obvious mythology with increasingly plausible history. As you move forward in time, they start with kingship descending from heaven and end with kings. We can actually verify from multiple sources a gradual transition from pure myth through legend into something approaching reliable history, though the line between categories remains fuzzy because the Sumerians themselves didn't draw hard distinctions between mythical and historical time. It was all part of one continuous story, and throughout these narratives, the Anunnaki appear regularly in the background. They're the divine council that grants kingship to favored cities. They're the ones determining fates. They're the 7 judges of the underworld. In some texts, they're the audience for humanity's dramas, sometimes intervening, often merely watching, and their exact nature remains slippery. In some passages, they're clearly individual gods with names and personalities. In others, they're more like a collective divine force, and trying to systematize this into coherent theology will drive you slightly mad. Generations of scholars have attempted it, producing elaborate charts of divine genealogies and hierarchies that immediately encounter contradictions in the next text they examine. Because again, the Sumerians weren't systematic theologians, they were practical people dealing with multiple local traditions, political pressures, and the creative additions of countless scribes over centuries, so we end up with a rich, complicated mess that refuses to resolve into simple categories, which is actually more interesting than tidy orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is boring. Give me the messy, contradictory human truth any day, and in terms of humanity's creation, which you'd think would be straightforward, but isn't, we have several accounts. In one, the goddess Ninhursag, or Nunma, creates humans from clay, sometimes with Enki's help, sometimes alone, and the first humans are imperfect. The gods have to workshop the design a bit, which is delightful, divine trial and error, and in the most famous account from Atrahasis, though that's Akkadian, rather than pure Sumerian, the gods create humans to be their laborers because the junior gods, the Ajigi, have gone on strike. They're tired of digging irrigation canals, so the solution is to create a new species to do the hard work. Humans are essentially meant to be divine employees. Our purpose is to maintain the temples and feed the gods through sacrifice. A rather bleak job description that nevertheless held remarkable staying power throughout Mesopotamian history, and modern readers often find this unsettling. We prefer myths where humanity is special, beloved, made in God's image with inherent dignity, and here we're glorified janitors of heaven. But there's also something weirdly honest about it. The Sumerians looked at their own society, where most people performed endless agricultural labor to support a small elite, and they projected that structure onto the cosmic scale. As above, so below indeed. At least they weren't pretending the system was anything other than what it was, and within this framework individual humans could still achieve remarkable things. Kings could be heroes, poets could create beauty, the clever could prosper, but collectively we existed to serve, which is perhaps not so different from many other religious frameworks. When you strip away the comforting rhetoric, and Enki, despite being part of the divine establishment that created this system, often appears as humanity's advocate. He's the one who warns about the flood, the one who gifts us with knowledge and crafts, the one who tricks his fellow gods into making things better for us. A trickster figure in the best sense, and some have speculated he represents an older stratum of religious thought being incorporated into the newer Enlil-dominated pantheon. Or maybe he's just a convenient narrative device for explaining how humans learned things the gods might have preferred we didn't know. Every mythology needs a Prometheus figure, and Enki, with his craftiness, and his association with wisdom magic and the sweet waters that make life possible, certainly fits that role, though unlike Prometheus, he rarely gets punished for his helpfulness. He's too clever to get caught, or perhaps he's powerful enough that the other gods tolerate his shenanigans because they need his expertise, and the scholarly consensus is that these myths served multiple functions simultaneously. They were entertainment, certainly, good stories well told. They were theology, explaining the nature of reality and humanity's place in it. They were politics, justifying the existing social order. They were psychology, helping people process their experiences of an often harsh and capricious world. And they were pedagogy, teaching values and proper behavior through narrative example. So when we read about the Anunnaki making decisions, or establishing laws, or interacting with humanity, we're seeing all these layers at once, and different readers in ancient times probably emphasized different aspects depending on their needs and interests, just as modern readers bring their own frameworks, whether that's Joseph Campbell's monomyth or Jungian archetypes, or ancient astronaut theories, or feminist rereadings of goddess worship, or whatever lens seems most useful, and none of these approaches is necessarily wrong, so long as they don't claim to be the only valid interpretation. The texts can support multiple readings. They're rich enough for that, though some readings are definitely better supported by evidence than others. When you claim the Anunnaki were literally extraterrestrials based on cherry-picked phrases while ignoring the vast bulk of textual and archaeological evidence that presents them as thoroughly conventional, albeit Mesopotamia, gods, you've left the realm of plausible interpretation and entered creative fiction, which is fine as fiction, but frustrating when presented as hidden truth, suppressed by mainstream archaeology, because mainstream archaeology is actually desperate for exciting discoveries. There's no conspiracy to suppress evidence. If anything, the field would love to find something paradigm-shifting. That's how you make your career. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and blurry photographs of ambiguous cylinder seals don't quite cut it. Meanwhile, the actual evidence we have, thousands of tablets painstakingly translated and contextualized, reveals something more subtle and interesting than ancient aliens. It reveals how an ancient people made sense of their world, how they understood power and divinity and human purpose, and that understanding, while alien to us, is comprehensible. We can follow their logic even when we don't share their premises, and that's the real gift these texts offer. Not secrets of anti-gravity or fusion reactors or whatever, but insight into human meaning-making across vast temporal distance, the recognition that people have always struggled with the same fundamental questions and produced different but equally sophisticated answers. And as the night deepens and your breathing slows, matching the ancient rhythm of these stories that were told and retold beside fires and in temple courtyards and during harvest festivals for generation upon generation, you might find yourself less interested in whether the Anunnaki were real in some literal sense, and more appreciative of the fact that they were real to the people who worshipped them, real enough to build civilization around, real enough to inspire sublime art and literature, real enough to provide comfort in uncertainty and structure in chaos, which is perhaps what gods have always done regardless of their ontological status, their humanity's way of organizing reality into narrative, and narrative is how we survive, how we create meaning from the random flux of existence. So whether you believe in the Anunnaki as literal beings, or metaphorical constructs, or literary characters, they served their purpose, they helped people live, and that's something worth honoring as we sink deeper into sleep. The goddess Inanna descends into the underworld, stripping away her divine garments and powers at each of the 7 gates until she stands naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. And this myth, recorded in several versions, is perhaps the most famous Sumerian story. It resonates with incredible power even today, a journey into darkness, a confrontation with death, and eventually a resurrection, though at terrible cost. And historically, Inanna, or Ishtar in her Akkadian form, was worshipped across Mesopotamia as goddess of love and warfare, fertility and violence, that peculiar combination that seems contradictory, until you remember that both sex and war involve the transgression of boundaries, the mixing of self and other, whether in intimacy or conflict. And Inanna is the ultimate boundary crosser. She's ambitious, demanding, passionate, sometimes destructive, the divine embodiment of desire in all its forms, and her cult was enormously popular, her temples numerous, her priestesses powerful, including specialized ritual prostitutes, a practice that scandalized later moralists, but within Sumerian context, was a legitimate form of worship, sexuality being sacred rather than shameful, at least certain forms of sexuality in certain contexts. They weren't complete libertines. Contrary to Victorian imaginings of ancient orgies, they had rules and categories like any society, but their categories differed from ours, and we must resist the urge to judge them by our standards. And in the descent myth, Inanna decides to attend the funeral of her sister's husband Gugalana, the bull of heaven, whom Inanna herself caused to be killed in a different myth. So this is already awkward, and Ereshkigal is understandably not thrilled about her sister's visit. She instructs the gatekeeper to treat Inanna according to the ancient laws, which means at each gate, Inanna must remove one item of clothing or power: her crown, her lapis lazuli beads, her breastplate, her gold ring, her lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, which are symbols of her authority, and she protests at each gate, but continues descending, compelled by forces even she doesn't fully control, until finally, she enters the throne room naked and powerless, and Ereshkigal kills her, or the 7 judges of the underworld, who are sometimes identified as Anunnaki, pass judgment and kill her, turning her corpse into meat that's hung on a hook like something in a butcher shop, genuinely disturbing imagery that doesn't pull punches about death's reality. And up above, the world begins to die. Without Inanna's presence, fertility ceases, nothing mates, nothing reproduces, everything grinds to a halt, which demonstrates her cosmic importance. She's not just a goddess among many, but an essential force, and Enki cleverly creates magical beings who can enter the underworld without being trapped by its laws. They find Inanna's corpse, sprinkle it with the water and food of life, and she revives. But the underworld doesn't release anyone without a substitute. Someone must take her place, and when Inanna returns to the surface, she finds her husband Dumuzi sitting on her throne, looking rather too comfortable, not exactly mourning her absence, so in fury, she designates him as her replacement, and Dumuzi flees. There's a whole additional cycle about his flight, and eventual capture, and eventually a compromise is reached, where Dumuzi spends half the year in the underworld, and his sister Geshtinana takes the other half, creating a seasonal cycle that explains the agricultural year, summer abundance and winter scarcity, myth encoding ecological observation. And this story works on so many levels, simultaneously. It's almost showing off. It's a fertility myth explaining the seasons. It's a psychological journey through depression and recovery. It's a meditation on power and pride. It's an exploration of the relationship between love and death. And it features the Anunnaki in their role as underworld judges, enforcers of cosmic law, the stern administrators of mortality that even gods must respect. And scholars debate the myth's origins and meaning endlessly, some seeing ancient Neolithic goddesses behind Inanna's figure, Earth mothers whose worship predates Sumerian civilization, others warning against projecting modern assumptions about prehistoric religion onto complex Bronze Age texts. And the debate about prehistoric goddess worship gets quite heated, actually, with feminist scholars seeing evidence of an earlier, more egalitarian society where women held religious power, and critics arguing this is wishful thinking, unsupported by archaeological evidence. And honestly, both sides make some valid points. We do find female figurines across Neolithic sites, which suggests feminine divinity was important, but interpreting these as evidence of matriarchy or universal goddess worship requires assumptions we can't prove. Meanwhile, dismissing them entirely seems like an overcorrection. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. Yes, feminine divine figures were important. No, this doesn't mean society was matriarchal. Religious authority and political authority don't always align, and the Sumerian evidence shows women in religious roles, priestesses with real power and property, but society was still patriarchal overall, with men dominating political and military spheres, complex as real life tends to be. And Inanna herself is a complicated figure for modern goddess worship movements, because she's not particularly nurturing or maternal. She's aggressive, sexually demanding, vengeful when crossed, not the Earth Mother archetype at all, but something wilder and less domesticated, which makes her more interesting, honestly. And her myths don't present her as faultless. She causes problems. Her actions have consequences. She has to learn humility through literal death and resurrection. There's genuine character development, which is remarkable in texts this ancient. We think of character development as a relatively modern narrative sophistication, but here it is, 4,000 years ago, proof that good storytelling is timeless. And in terms of humanity's relationship with the Anunnaki, the Inanna myths show us as somewhat peripheral. We're affected by divine dramas, but we don't drive them. When Inanna and Ereshkigal fight, it's about their own sister rivalry, not about us. And when Dumuzi dies annually, it causes agricultural impact. But that's almost incidental to the personal tragedy. The gods live their own lives, pursue their own goals, and humanity experiences the side effects, which again is rather different from religions that place humanity at the center of divine attention. Here we're important but not central, valued but not irreplaceable. The cosmos would continue without us, though certain functions would be inconvenienced. It's a more modest assessment of human significance that might actually be healthier than thinking we're creation's pinnacle and purpose. A little cosmic humility never hurt anyone. And these myths were performed, we should remember. They weren't just read silently, but enacted in temple rituals, sung or chanted with musical accompaniment, experienced communally during festivals, and the sacred marriage ritual was particularly important. It involved the king, or his representative, and a priestess of Inanna ritually enacting divine union to ensure fertility for the coming year. Actual sex was possibly involved, though scholars debate this. Regardless, the ritual claimed to bridge human and divine realms, temporarily making the king into Dumuzi and the priestess into Inanna, collapsing the distinction between mythic time and historical time. And understanding this performative dimension helps us grasp how the myths functioned. They weren't just stories about the past, but living present realities reactivated through ritual. The Anunnaki weren't merely beings who existed long ago, but powers that could be accessed and engaged with through proper ceremony, which is a very different religious orientation than modern literalism or metaphorical interpretation. It's somewhere between or beyond both categories. And if you tried to ask a Sumerian priest whether Inanna literally descended to the underworld as historical event, or whether it's metaphorical, he might not understand the question. Those categories might not have mapped onto his thinking. The descent happened in sacred time, mythic time, which is real, but different from everyday time. And perhaps we've lost something in our compulsive need to categorize everything as literally true or merely symbolic. Perhaps there are other modes of truth that ancient peoples accessed more easily than we do in our disenchanted rational world. Or perhaps I'm romanticizing, and they were just as confused about metaphysics we are, simply using different vocabulary. It's genuinely hard to know, and here we encounter the fundamental frustration and fascination of studying ancient religion. We have their texts, their temples, their ritual objects, but we can never quite access their interiority, their lived experience of belief. We can describe what they did, but not fully know what it felt like from inside, which is true of all historical study really. We're always outside looking in, assembling evidence into narrative, while knowing the narrative is incomplete, and yet we try, because the alternative is letting these voices fall silent, these stories that people considered worth preserving, worth copying and recopying for generations, worth building temples around and organizing societies by. They deserve our attention, even if our understanding is necessarily imperfect, and the Anunnaki as they appear in these myths are genuinely alien in many ways. Their motivations don't always make sense to us. Their ethics are pre-modern, they're patriarchal and violent and capricious. They demand worship and sacrifice. They play favorites among cities and kings, and yet they're also recognizably people. They love and hate and scheme and regret. They make mistakes and learn from them, or don't. They're everything divinity was before it got abstract and philosophical, before Plato and Aristotle turned God into the unmoved mover. These are gods with bodies and appetites and family drama, gods who walk on earth and meddle in human affairs, and occasionally regret creating us, but can't quite bring themselves to finish the job of destroying us, because then who would feed them? And there's something darkly comic about that last point, the gods' dependence on human offerings, creating a stay of execution. We survive through making ourselves indispensable, a very Mesopotamian solution. Their whole civilization ran on making yourself too useful to be disposed of, climbing the hierarchy through competence and strategic relationships. And the myths reflect this. Enki survives his brother's displeasure through being the clever one who solves problems. Inanna maintains her position through force of personality and crossing boundaries others fear. Humanity itself persists through diligent service. Everyone's working the system, navigating power structures, both human and divine. And if you find this cynical, that's fair, but it's also realistic. Idealistic religions that pretend power doesn't matter, or that merit alone determines outcomes, were always selling something. The Sumerians looked at reality unflinchingly and built their theology accordingly. Your success depends on pleasing those above you, whether that's your city's governor or your city's god. Might as well be honest about it, and yet within this framework, there's still room for genuine devotion. The hymns they wrote to Inanna and Enki and the others are beautiful, full of authentic praise and longing. Knowing the gods are powerful and capricious doesn't prevent loving them. Possibly it makes love more necessary. When the universe is uncertain and dangerous, you cling to what protection you can find. And the gods at least provide that. They're powerful. They notice you. If you're pious enough, they might intervene on your behalf. It's not certain, but it's better than facing the chaos alone. And as you drift deeper into sleep, these ancient patterns of belief and ritual and myth swirl through your consciousness. You're walking through a ziggurat in dreamtime, climbing the mud brick stairs toward the temple at the summit where priestesses chant in a language you almost understand, and around you the Anunnaki gather in their assembly, deciding fates, measuring destinies, their faces obscured by the incense smoke that fills the sacred chamber, and you understand without being told that you're witnessing something important. A moment when human and divine realms intersect, when the stories become real, or were always real, but you're only now perceiving them properly, and then the vision fades, and you're back in your bed, in your time, but somewhere in your sleeping mind, the myths continue, the stories that have survived millennia, still doing their work, still organizing chaos into meaning, still connecting you to that long chain of humans who looked at the stars and told stories about gods. The Bronze Age collapses, and everything changes. Around 1200 BCE, the great civilizations of the ancient Near East implode within a few generations. The Hittites vanish, the Mycenaeans fall, Egypt survives but diminished, and across the region cities burn, trade networks dissolve, literacy declines, populations crash. Archaeologists call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and its causes are debated fiercely. Was it the mysterious sea peoples invading from somewhere? Was it climate change causing droughts and famine? Was it systems collapse, when trade networks became too interdependent? Was it earthquake storms? Was it all of these together? Scholarly consensus leans toward multiple factors reinforcing each other, a perfect storm of catastrophes that overwhelm society's ability to adapt, and Mesopotamia weathers the crisis better than some regions, but still suffers. Cities decline, empires fragment, and when civilization rebuilds itself in the Iron Age, the Sumerians as a distinct people have essentially vanished, absorbed into the broader Akkadian-speaking populations that dominate the region, and Sumerian continues as a liturgical language, the way Latin would later survive after Rome's fall. Priests still learn it, texts are still copied, but nobody speaks it at home anymore. It's become a dead language kept alive artificially through institutional momentum, and yet the myths survive. The Babylonians and Assyrians who inherit Mesopotamian civilization adopt the old stories, adapting them, changing emphases, adding new material. The Anunnaki continue to appear in texts, though their role gradually shifts, and the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, written probably around 1800 to 1600 BCE though preserved in later copies, features the god Marduk conquering Tiamat, the primordial ocean, and creating the world from her corpse, and the Anunnaki appear as supporting players. They praise Marduk's victory and help establish cosmic order under his supremacy. Because this is Babylonian propaganda, the text justifies Babylon's political dominance through theological narrative. Marduk becomes king of the gods, the way Babylon becomes head of the empire, as above so below yet again. And scholars note how this represents a shift from the earlier, more democratic divine councils toward autocracy, one supreme god ruling lesser deities who become almost irrelevant. And this mirrors political developments. The old Sumerian city-state system with its balancing powers gave way to empire with centralized authority, and naturally theology adapted to legitimize the new order, which is how these things work. Religions rarely drive political change. Usually they sanctify what's already happening, providing divine justification for earthly arrangements, and the old Sumerian myths get reinterpreted, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, to serve Babylonian or Assyrian interests, and we can trace these changes through the texts, watching how stories morph across centuries. And it's fascinating but also melancholy because we're watching the original meanings erode, the specifically Sumerian worldview, with all its peculiarities getting smoothed away into more generic ancient Near Eastern religion. And by the time we reach the Neo-Babylonian period in the first millennium BCE, Sumerian culture exists only in archaeological layers and archived texts, and then Persia conquers, Alexander conquers, the Seleucids rule, the Parthians displace them, empires rise and fall, and finally, even Babylonian civilization ends. The last cuneiform tablet is inscribed around 75 CE, a few astronomical observations, and then nothing. 2,000 years of continuous literary tradition falls silent, the scribal schools close, the temples are abandoned, the languages are forgotten, and the knowledge painstakingly accumulated over millennia disappears. Yes, disappears, because nobody can read cuneiform anymore. The tablets with their wedge-shaped marks are just bricks to later peoples. They're recycled as building materials or left to erode in ruins. And all those myths about the Anunnaki, all that theological sophistication, all those administrative records, and royal inscriptions, and legal codes and hymns and lamentations, gone, forgotten so thoroughly that by medieval times, people looked at ziggurats and couldn't imagine what they'd been. The Tower of Babel story in Genesis is probably a garbled memory of Babylonian ziggurats, but the actual history was completely lost. And this remained true until the 19th century, when European and American archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites and finding tablets by the thousands, and early on, nobody could read them. Cuneiform was an absolute mystery, but eventually through brilliant linguistic detective work, scholars cracked the code, starting with Old Persian, which used a simpler version of cuneiform, then working backward to Akkadian, finally Sumerian, and slowly the ancient texts yielded their secrets, and suddenly, we had access to the direct voices of the ancient Mesopotamians, not filtered through Greek or Hebrew intermediaries, but in their own words, and the sheer volume of material was overwhelming. Thousands and thousands of tablets, most still unpublished even today, sitting in museum basements, waiting for someone with the specialized knowledge to translate them. Because learning Sumerian is hard, it's not related to any modern language, it's a linguistic isolate, and there are only a few hundred people in the world who can read it competently, so translation proceeds slowly, and we're still discovering things, still refining our understanding. The field is very much alive despite dealing with dead languages, and every so often a new tablet surfaces, sometimes from legitimate excavation, sometimes from the illicit antiquities trade, which is an ethical nightmare, and occasionally these new finds genuinely change our understanding, filling gaps in stories we thought we knew, or revealing entirely unknown myths. And the Anunnaki as we now understand them are a reconstruction from fragmentary evidence, multiple texts in different states of preservation from different time periods, reflecting different local traditions, and scholars have assembled this into a more or less coherent picture, but we should remember it's still a picture with missing pieces, and some of those pieces might fundamentally change the interpretation if we found them. We're always one tablet away from revising everything, which makes the field exciting but also humbling. Any confident statement about what the Sumerians believed should be tentative, provisional, subject to revision, and yet we make these statements because we need to. Because partial knowledge is still knowledge. Because the alternative is saying nothing, which helps nobody. So we carefully describe what we think we know, while acknowledging uncertainty. And when popular writers skip the careful part and present speculation as fact, that's when professionals get irritated. Not because we're gatekeepers jealously guarding our expertise, though academics can be territorial like any profession, but because misrepresenting ancient cultures is a form of disrespect. These were real people who deserve to be understood accurately, not turned into props for modern agendas, whether those agendas are ancient astronaut theories or contemporary religious polemics or whatever. And the Anunnaki in particular have been so thoroughly appropriated by fringe theories that it's sometimes hard to discuss them seriously. Mention the word and people immediately think of Zecharia Sitchin's books claiming they were extraterrestrials from Planet X who genetically engineered humans. And look, Sitchin's books are entertaining fiction. I'll give them that, but they're not history. His translations are wrong, often hilariously wrong. He claims words mean things they don't mean, ignores context, cherry-picks passages, and constructs elaborate theories on foundations of sand, and actual Sumerologists have thoroughly debunked his work. You can find detailed takedowns online showing exactly where he goes wrong, but debunking doesn't seem to help. The theories are too appealing. They promise secret knowledge, ancient wisdom suppressed by mainstream academia, and people want to believe there's hidden truth that explains everything. It's the same impulse that drives conspiracy theories generally, the desire for a grand unified explanation that makes sense of complexity and makes you feel special for knowing what others don't. And I get the appeal, I do. Mainstream history can seem boring by comparison. Crop rotation and tax records versus ancient astronauts. But here's the thing. Real history is actually weirder and more interesting than the made-up versions. The Anunnaki, as the Sumerians actually understood them, are fascinating precisely because they're not generic space aliens, but specific culturally embedded deities reflecting a particular civilization's worldview. Understanding them requires understanding Sumerian society, economics, politics, environment, all the messy contextual details that fringe theories strip away in favor of simplified drama. And when you do the work to understand the context, when you read the myths, not as encoded alien messages, but as the literary products of real human communities trying to make sense of their world, they come alive in ways that ancient astronaut theories can never match. You see the humor, the anxiety, the political maneuvering, the genuine religious feeling, all the texture that makes them human documents, and that humanity across vast temporal distance is the real magic. Not that gods were aliens, but that ancient people were people, as complicated and contradictory and creative as us, and their myths are our myths, in a deep sense. They're humanity, doing what humanity does, telling stories, building meaning, creating culture. And when Sumerian civilization fell and the languages died and the tablets were buried, those stories didn't end. They morphed into new forms, influenced Hebrew scripture, and thus Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, influenced Greek thought, influenced every subsequent civilization that built on Mesopotamian foundations, which is basically all of Western culture and much of Eastern. The Sumerians may be gone, but their legacy isn't. It's everywhere, once you know to look for it. Our base 60-time system, our 360-degree circle, concepts of law and kingship and temple religion, agricultural techniques, mathematical notation, even some of our myths and moral frameworks have Sumerian DNA in them, and the Anunnaki specifically may have faded from worship, but the questions they embodied persist. Questions about divine justice, about humanity's purpose, about the relationship between power and morality, about how to live in an uncertain world under the gaze of forces you can't fully control or understand. These are permanent human questions. We keep asking them, keep answering them differently, keep telling new stories that are secretly old stories in updated clothes. And as you sink into the final stages of sleep, your conscious mind shutting down for the night, your brain processing the day's experiences and integrating them into long-term memory through the mysterious alchemy of dreaming, perhaps some small part of this journey through ancient Mesopotamia lodges itself in your neural networks. These stories about gods and floods and descents into the underworld, mixing with your own memories and concerns and hopes, becoming part of the vast associative web of meaning that makes you you. And maybe that's the ultimate fate of the Anunnaki, not to be literally believed or comprehensively understood, but to be part of the great human conversation that spans millennia. Voices in the darkness telling us we're not alone. Others have wondered and feared and hoped before us. And somehow that's comforting, that we're part of a continuity even as everything changes, even as civilizations rise and fall, and languages die, and the very landscape transforms beyond recognition. The core human drive to make meaning persists, and in that sense the Anunnaki live on, not in the form the Sumerians would recognize, transformed past their awareness, but still here, still doing their work of organizing chaos into story, still connecting us to something larger than our individual lives. So we've journeyed together through 4,000 years of history and myth, starting in Eridu, where the first temples rose from Mesopotamian marshland, through the great divine councils where Enlil and Enki shaped cosmic order, following Inanna into the underworld and back again, and finally watching as civilizations fell and rose again, as cuneiform tablets were buried and forgotten, and eventually deciphered, as the Anunnaki transformed from living gods to archaeological curiosities to elements of modern pop mythology. And if you've made it this far, you're either deeply asleep, which was the goal all along, or you're actually fascinated by Bronze Age theology, which makes you a kindred spirit, and I appreciate you. And looking back over everything we've covered, the most striking thing is perhaps the continuity beneath the changes. Yes, political systems transformed, languages died, religions evolved, but the fundamental human concerns remained constant. The Sumerians worried about harvests and floods, and whether they'd please the gods, and whether their king was legitimate, and whether there was meaning beyond the daily grind. Exactly the concerns people still have in different vocabulary, and the Anunnaki in all their contradictory textual appearances served a function that still needs serving. They provided a framework for understanding existence. They gave people a sense of connection to powers beyond themselves. They explained why bad things happen to good people, through divine caprice, and why good things happen at all, through divine favor. And whether we believe those specific gods existed is in some ways less important than recognizing that the human need for such frameworks persists. We still tell ourselves stories about how the world works, and what it all means. We've just replaced gods with other mechanisms: economics, evolution, psychology, quantum physics. Our myths are supposedly scientific now, but they still serve mythic functions, providing ultimate explanations and moral frameworks and reassurance that reality has some underlying structure, however difficult to perceive. And perhaps future archaeologists studying our civilization will find our confidence in scientific materialism as quaint as we find Sumerian polytheism, or perhaps not. Perhaps we've actually figured out objective truth in ways they couldn't. But either way, the impulse is recognizable, humans explaining their world with the best tools available, and in that sense we're not so different from those ancient scribes pressing reeds into wet clay, recording their beliefs and concerns for posterity, hoping someone would remember, hoping their words would matter. And here we are 4 millennia later, still reading them, still finding meaning in their stories, which is a kind of immortality, even if it's not the kind they imagined. They probably assumed their gods would be worshipped forever, that cuneiform would never be forgotten. Sumerian civilization was permanent. Those assumptions were wrong, but their words survived anyway, through accident and persistence, and sheer durability of baked clay. And maybe there's a lesson there about what endures. Not political power, which proved remarkably transient, not even religious belief, which transformed beyond recognition, but stories, art, the human voice preserved in whatever medium. Those things last. The Anunnaki as gods are dead, but the Anunnaki as literary characters, as windows into an ancient worldview, as prompts for reflection on divinity and power and meaning, they live on, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps asking more is greedy. The Sumerians got to exist, to build something remarkable, to look at the stars and tell stories about what they saw, to make art and love and war, and eventually fade away like all civilizations do, like ours will someday. Everything ends, but between the beginning and end is the story, and the story can be beautiful, even when it's tragic, or perhaps especially when it's tragic, because beauty without mortality would be somehow less. Knowing it won't last makes it precious, and you're probably too tired now to follow this philosophical meandering. Your eyes are closed, your breathing is slow and deep, and these words are just sounds, rhythm without meaning, a gentle current carrying you down into sleep, into dreams where perhaps you'll walk through ancient Uruk, watching the sunset turn the mud brick walls golden, hearing distant chanting from the temple complex, and tomorrow you won't remember the details, but you'll wake feeling like you've traveled somewhere distant, which you have. You've been to the 3rd millennium BCE and back. You've met the Anunnaki in all their strange glory. You've touched something ancient and survived. And if you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing, hit that notification bell, leave a comment about which ancient civilization I should cover next. The usual YouTube requests except whispered softly so as not to disturb anyone already sleeping. And I'll be back soon with another story from history's depths, another culture to explore, another chance to feel connected to the vast human past. But for now, just rest. Let the Anunnaki fade back into clay and cuneiform where they belong. Let the weight of millennia fall away. Let go of trying to understand everything. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some questions don't need answers. Sleep itself is a descent into underworld of sorts. 7 gates we pass through nightly, stripping away consciousness, layer by layer, until nothing remains but the raw experience of existence. And unlike Inanna, we make this journey safely. We return each morning, resurrected, another gift we usually take for granted. So sleep well, dream of ziggurats if you dream at all, and remember that whatever challenges you face, whatever uncertainties plague you, you're part of a continuity that stretches back to the very beginning of civilization. You're heir to all that accumulated wisdom and foolishness, all those generations who somehow survived and passed the torch forward until it reached you. And that's something that matters. You matter. Your story is part of the great human story that began when the first person looked at the stars and wondered. And as the night wraps around you like soft wool, as your mind releases its grip on consciousness and slides into the eternal now of deep sleep, carry with you this small comfort. You've been heard. Your presence here has mattered, even if only to me, even if only for these few hours we've shared across the digital void. And maybe that's what the Anunnaki were ultimately about. Connection, the sense that we're not alone in the darkness, that something out there knows we exist, and maybe even cares. Whether that something is gods or community, or just the fact of being human together. All of us confused and hopeful, and trying our best with limited information. And on that note, I'll let you go, release you to whatever dreams may come, with gratitude for your attention, and hope that you found something useful here. Sweet dreams, traveler. May your descent be peaceful, and your return assured. May the ancient gods watch over you, if gods there be, and may you wake tomorrow refreshed and ready to face whatever the day brings. Good night, sleep well, and thank you for letting me share these ancient stories with you. Until next time.